Hey everyone, welcome to A12, and today we're looking at discussing the use of breeding systems in animal production, including crossbreeding and line breeding. So we're talking about here systems or tools that the farmer can use in the ways that they manage breeding. So we've already looked at methods for reproduction to occur, we've looked at hormones, but this one is particularly ways that the farmers manage the genetics of their herds. So different systems, two different systems that they use to manage the genetics and how the genetics are passed on. And so that the one we have to look at first is line breeding. We're going to look at first, and then crossbreeding second. But these are the two methods that you need to know, both of them, because it isn't including dot point. So first of all, it's important that we understand what a breeding system is. And let's have a look at a couple of terms here that we need to know. So these are things that if you are doing biology, you might know already, but the actual genes that an animal has are known as its genotype. So these are the genes that an animal gets from their parents. They get half from their mother and half from their father. And so that describes their genotype. Now, we know that what you have in your genes isn't always expressed. Only certain traits are expressed. You will know about dominant and recessive genes. So even though you might have a dominant gene from your mother or a recessive gene from your father for, say, hair color or eye color or something like that, only one of them is going to show. So the dominant trait will normally show, but the genotype is talking about all of the genes you have, whether you have dominant and recessive genes for multiple different hair colors or eye colors. However, we know that also an animal or a human even is a product of its genes, but also the impact of the environment. And this is what produces the animal's phenotype. So what we actually end up with, or what animals actually end up with, is its phenotype, how the genes express themselves in reality. So for example, the breed might be the genotype, and that sets the upper limit of, say, muscle growth, or for example, a Hereford in terms of marbling, it can't do it because its breed won't allow it to, its genes won't allow it to. However, an Angus gene type or genotype will allow it to marble, but obviously the phenotype, whether it does marble or not, depends on how much nutrition it gets when it is growing. So even though it might have the ability or the genotype to marble, if it doesn't get enough nutrition, its phenotype or what it displays will be no marbling or little marbling. But of course, the genotype, if it can marble, if it's an Angus cow, for example, and it can marble, it has the genotype to be able to marble. If it has the environment or the feed, in this case, which is adequate for it to marble, then its phenotype will be a high amount of marbling. So phenotype equals what trait is actually expressed and by how much. So animal production can be improved by altering the environment, such as the feed, the climate, the level of disease and pests and things like that, or we can alter the genotype. And so what we're looking at here with breeding systems is altering the genes, not so much the environment, but the genes of the animal and how we manage the improvement of the genes. So some characteristics or traits in animals are highly heritable, which means they're easily passed on. So heritable just means the chance of being passed on. So if something is highly heritable, it means if you mate animals with that trait, there's a high chance that it's going to be passed on to its offspring. On the other side, if it's lowly heritable trait, then it means it's not going to be passed on very easily to its offspring. It's going to be hard to pass on. And that's normally for rarer traits. Because they're not passed on, they're not very common. So examples of highly heritable traits here are milking volume, calving ease, marbling, etc. They are ones that producers, farmers will target because they're easy to pass on. So they will want to target them in their breeding systems, whether it be line breeding or crossbreeding. And then lastly here, systems there can be lots of systems. We're only looking at two of them. You could have a completely random system, so you wouldn't bother about thinking, I want to breed this animal with this animal. You just put males with females and they breed how they will, and you get what you get, and that's random. There's no kind of plan, there's no way of doing it. It's just completely random. The other option is inbreeding, where you're just breeding close relatives or brothers with sisters. And we're not looking at that really specifically, but we're looking at line breeding. Now, line breeding is a form of inbreeding because you are breeding related animals to each other. You're not breeding brothers with sisters, but you're breeding either fathers with daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters, or mothers with sons, grandsons and great-grandsons, etc. So line breeding is a form of inbreeding, which we're going to look at to start with, and then crossbreeding, which just simply means crossing different breeds together. So you are choosing animals of two different breeds, say Angus and Hereford, and multiply or crossing those together. So first of all, it's important that we know what a breeding system is. That's what this dot point is about. It's about breeding systems. And so basically it's a way of a farmer kind of structuring the sexual behavior of their animals, and it determines which males mate with which females. So with these two different systems we're looking at, there's different ways or strategies of breeding animals together to give you a different result. And so what we'd call this a management tool, or a thing that the farmer can use to improve the genetic makeup of their herd and flock. And so they're going to choose different traits in different animals, and they're going to get animals in the future through different methods, whether it be line breeding, whether it be crossbreeding. They're going to have their future generations improved through the way that they breed and the animals that they breed together. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at line breeding. Shortly, we'll look at crossbreeding, but this is number one, line breeding. So like I said a second ago, this is a type of inbreeding. There's related animals being bred together, and it's based on a common ancestor. So a sire, which means a male parent, or a dam, which means a female parent, are used over several generations of mating, and its value depends on the degree of superiority of the outstanding individual. So in this case, they've used a really good quality male bull, and this animal needs to be really, really, superb quality in whatever it might be, whether it's muscle score, or carcass composition, or maturity rate, or something like that. But it needs to be really far and above any other animal that they have to kind of make this worthwhile. In this case, they've chosen the male, but they could equally choose the female if it was outstanding to do the same thing as this. What you end up with line breeding is it's the kind of the closest way to cloning an animal that there is that you can do naturally. Obviously, we've cloned sheep, for example, like the famous Dolly the sheep, which was cloned, and there's a few issues with that, but that was done due to processes that were done in a lab. But this after a number of generations leads to an animal that is 93.75% resembling the genes of the original father or male here. So this animal here, the male one, is these offspring here have 93.75% of their genes are identical to this male. So you can see that this method leads to what we might term as pretty close to a natural form of cloning, where you're not using anything. There's no lab process in the lab or anything like that. It's just quote unquote natural mating, and you're ending up with almost a cloned animal. So what's happening here is the male is bred with this female, and this is obviously, like I said, a very good quality male. It's bred with this female, and they have offspring. And now, for the sake of this, we need this offspring here to be female. So they might have multiple offspring, but one of the female ones is bred with its father. So this is father and daughter, and they are mated together, and they give you another offspring here, which is the granddaughter of this male, and also the daughter. So in the first generation, so when this male and this female have a first calf, that first calf is 50%. Its genes are 50% of the father and 50% of the mother. But this animal that you've had here is 50-50. So if you mate this first generation back with its own father, the second generation here is going to have 75% of its genes are going to be the same as its father, and 25% the same as the original mother. And then you can see as you mate the granddaughter with the original father, with the grandfather, and then the great-granddaughter with the great-grandfather, etc., you can see the increasing percentages. So it goes to 87.5%, and then a 12.5%, 87.5% the same genes as the original male, and 12.5% this original female, and then as we get to the 4th generation here, you get 93.75% same genes as the original male, and only 6.25% the same as the female. Now the advantage of this is you're basically replicating this male in a natural form, so without any process in the lab. So let's have a look at advantages. You achieve a high degree of uniformity of genes or type, and production, so milking volume, marbling, etc., is obtained, and it means these cattle are consistent, and they'll consistently be able to be produced for the same market. This is because they're basically going to be once these generations, when you get down to this generation, they're going to be all very similar to this original male. So there's going to be very consistent cows that all of them are very consistent with, because their genes are so similar compared to, say, this one where they're 50-50. All right, the second point here, valuable traits of an animal are passed on to several generations, and the rate of progress is faster than in random breeding of animals. Because you're choosing one animal to replicate its genes here, the offspring and the generations down here are going to be a lot like this. Instead, if you're mating random animals to each other, it's going to lead to a whole pile of different traits, and your animals won't be consistent. And so overall, this kind of means that a breeder has better reputation because their animals are consistent. People know what they're getting, and it satisfies what people want and what buyers want and what the consumer wants. Disadvantages are, with any form of inbreeding, you get undesirable traits appearing, because if you have genetic defects, they get multiplied or they get shown more easily because they're all related, and so there's no new genes coming in. So you get poorer reproductive efficiency with higher mortality rates, lower growth rates, and higher frequency of hereditary or genetic abnormalities, which can be a downside. And lastly, you're reducing the genetic pool, because all of the animals that you have are going to be basically related. They're all going to be related to this animal here. And so if that has any defects, they will end up showing up quite strongly eventually. So these quotes here: line breeding is the mating of closely related animals in an attempt to concentrate desirable characteristics in its progeny, which just means offspring. And as breeding results in an increase in the level of homozygosity, which just means similarity of genetic traits, it can increase the risk of appearance of undesirable effects in the phenotype, what actually occurs, known as inbreeding depression. This is an example of a male animal from Millamurra. So it's got the which we went to on excursion, an Angus animal that is very good quality, which may have been line bred potentially. Number 2, this is the second one we need to know: crossbreeding. Crossbreeding is pretty straightforward. It just involves the mating of unrelated animals of different breeds. So these animals are not related to each other in any way, like the previous line breeding example, and they must come from different breeds. They cannot be from the same breed. That is what crossbreeding means, across different breeds. So here we have 2 clear examples of 2 different breeds. We have an Angus, it's 100% Angus, and we have a Hereford, and it's 100% Hereford. And when we cross them together, obviously one's a male, one's a female, we get an offspring that is 50% genetically related to the Angus and 50% genetically related to the Hereford. Now, when you cross animals together like this, some traits from one animal will show, while others won't from the other animal, and some traits from this animal, the Hereford, will show, while that trait won't show from the Angus. So an example here is Hereford is a larger animal, and it's going to give you a good carcass size. So the crossbred animal is going to be bigger than its Angus parent, and Herefords also have a really good mothering ability, so they look after their calves better, which means that they're going to they're more likely to survive and be of a better weight. So you get the good mothering ability from the Hereford. And then lastly, of course, we know that Angus is an example of a cow that will marble. Angus is going to give this offspring some level of marbling ability. If we have a look at some examples of crossbreeding systems, if this is kind of only relevant if you're going to get asked a question about crossbreeding, maybe a 6-mark question to evaluate crossbreeding, you might just throw in the names of a couple of systems of ways of doing crossbreeding, but here's three. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them because you don't need to know too much about them. But here we have Simmental crossed with Angus crossed with Hereford. So these females here are Simmental Hereford crosses, so 50-50, and then they're crossed with a purebred Angus, so 50-50 Simmental Hereford crossed with 100% Angus. And what you end up with there is you end up with the offspring of these two mating will be you just halve their percentages, so you get a 50% Angus and you get 25% Hereford and 25% Simmental, so that in the offspring that these two will have. And this kind of cross is known for its growth rates and also carcass traits. It's going to maximize hybrid vigor or heterosis, which I'll talk about in a second, maximize fertility and maximize milking ability, and it leads to a 20 to 40% increase in weaning weight of the animal when the calf is weaned, which means it's moving onto solid food and off the mother's milk. It has a 20 to 40% increase in weaning weight compared to, say, an Angus offspring or the offspring of one of these animals. Now, and that's called a terminal F1 because the first generation is the last animal that there will be. So let's have a look here at what heterosis means. So another word for heterosis is hybrid vigor, and a hybrid is basically crossbreeding when you're crossing one animal with another animal from another breed, and that still happens here. You still get heterosis or hybrid vigor here because you're crossing a cow of crossbreed here, but you're crossing it with another breed animal, and you still will get hybrid vigor or heterosis, which means exactly the same thing. And it just means that basically when you cross two different breeds together, the offspring will end up with it might show qualities that are over and above both of its parents. So it might show, if you cross an Angus and a Hereford, it might have a faster growth rate than both of its parents. It might have a higher fat percentage, or it might have a better mothering ability than either of its parents. That's what hybrid vigor means. They show better qualities than either of their parents do. And so basically, in other words, improved or enhanced function of any quality in the first generation. If you cross a Simmental Hereford with a Angus Hereford or something like that, then you're not going to tend to get hybrid vigor. So Topcross, this is just crossing a straight bull with straight cow, like 100%. You get, an example here is Hereford and Angus. You only get a 5 to 10% increase in weaning weight. You'll get hybrid vigor in the progeny only in the offspring of these two. But if you breed them any further down the line, you won't get hybrid vigor. And number 3, a crisscross or rotational. You've got a Hereford cross with an Angus, and then you're crossing the Hereford Angus with each other. And that is giving you a 10 to 20% increase in weaning weight, but you're not going to get, when you're crossing this Hereford Angus with a Hereford Angus, you're not going to get hybrid vigor any longer. So what you're trying to do here is bring together, this is a summary of crossbreeding, you're trying to bring together desired combinations of genes more rapidly than can be achieved by breeding animals of the same breed. So if you're just breeding Herefords with Herefords all the time, you're not going to be bringing in any new possibilities or genes. But if you cross a Hereford with an Angus, you can bring in new things that a Hereford doesn't have, like marbling, which we know of and is an easy example. If we have a look here at advantages and disadvantages of crossbreeding, in this system, in crossbreeding, new genes such as marbling, as I just said, are brought into the herd, which increases the gene pool within the cross, causing desirable traits from each breeds to be selected. Now, if you cross an Angus with a Hereford, for example, you have 4 offspring, not all of them are going to be the same. One of them might show better marbling, and the other 3 might not. So you might choose that one that shows better marbling, and you might reproduce that one instead of the other 3. So it's important still that you still need to manage after crossbreeding. You still need to manage the animals and make sure that you choose the qualities that you want. Secondly here, the crossbred progeny or hybrids are usually more vigorous than either of the parents. This is called hybrid vigor or heterosis. An example is Brahman cattle crossed with Hereford cattle grow at a faster rate than Brahman or Hereford cattle on their own. So that's a very good example there of hybrid vigor, where the crossed animal between Brahman and Hereford shows a better growth rate than either of their parents on their own. Lastly, disadvantages. Cattle can vary in characteristics. Like I said before, if you breed a Brahman with a Hereford or an Angus with a Hereford and you have 4 offspring, they're all going to show different traits. Whereas with line breeding, they're going to have much more consistent traits. And therefore, it's inconsistent in development and finishing. Cattle outside what you want or the desired specifications will need to be either killed from the herd to stop them from passing on those genes that you don't want, or maybe you could sell them off as well. So you don't mate them, and it will require careful management and tracking by the producer. All right, looking at the line breeding, crossbreeding, this here is just a summary basically of what we've already talked about into a table, and it'd be good for you here to write some kind of justification about why you might or might not use it, but that needs to be basically in your own words there. If we have a look at the past questions from the last couple of years for this dot point, you can see the first one is, how can crossbreeding be used to improve the productivity of an animal production system? So firstly, we'll say what crossbreeding is. It involves crossing 2 different breeds, and it can produce calves that are superior to both of their parents. That's why this is a key thing here, hybrid vigor. How can it be used to improve productivity? Hybrid vigor is an important one. You could also mention in here, potentially, which I didn't, that you're bringing in new traits from outside a breed. So if you cross a Hereford with an Angus, you're bringing in traits from the Angus, or you're bringing in traits from the Hereford that you didn't have in your original herd. And so this basically, the reason it's increasing productivity or improving productivity, I've been clear here, it's leading to improved growth rates or carcass characteristics, which is obviously going to lead to improved productivity, and it's only worth 2 marks, so that is enough there. These 2 multiple choice questions, 2014, the graph compares the growth rates for purebred and crossbred animals. What is the cause of the growth rate shown in crossbred animals? So you have this one, it's AA, so for name's sake, it could be Angus, so you're crossing an Angus with an Angus, or a Brahman with a Brahman, or whatever, a Hereford with Hereford. Over here you've got BB, and you're crossing whatever it might be, Angus, Hereford, it doesn't matter, but you're crossing the same thing with the same thing. And clearly this one here is the crossbreed, because you're crossing whatever it might be, Hereford with a Brahman, or an Angus with a Brahman, or an Angus with a Hereford. But this clearly here is the crossbreed that they're referring to, instead of these purebred ones here. So the cause of the growth rate, the difference that causes a better growth rate or compared to its original parents, we know clearly is hybrid vigor. It's not heritability, it just means the chance of passing things on. Dominance and codominance are not relevant to this answer. Lastly, in 2012, we have, what is the name of the breeding system which modifies a characteristic of a plant or animal by inserting a single gene into the cell? Now, this is not totally related to this dot point, but I thought I'd include it. And obviously, genetic engineering or genetic modification is the method where we insert a single gene in a lab into a cell, and that modification just changes one aspect of a plant or animal. So that is the end of this dot point.